Step into the dark nurseries of Victorian England, where bedtime stories weren't meant to comfort, but to terrify. Imagine a children's book so disturbing that parents used it as a weapon of fear, where innocent pictures hid tales of mutilation, death, and horror. In 1845, a German doctor created what would become the most notorious children's book ever published. Its pages showed children having their thumbs cut off with giant scissors, a little girl burning to death until only ashes remained, a boy starving himself into a skeleton and dying in just 5 days. But this wasn't considered child abuse. This was considered good parenting. The book was called Struwwelpeter, and it spread across Europe like a plague, translated into dozens of languages, terrifying generations of children who heard its tales whispered in darkened rooms. Once you learn what Victorian parents read to their children at bedtime, once you understand why these horrific tales were considered educational and unnecessary, you'll realize that childhood as we know it today is a very recent invention. Join me as we open the pages of the book that haunted an entire era. Welcome back, Darklings. Before we look into the horrors within its pages, let's first understand how this nightmare came to be. The year is 1844, and in Frankfurt, Germany, a respected physician named Heinrich Hoffmann faces a problem that would change the course of children's literature forever. It's nearly Christmas, and Hoffmann wants to find the perfect book for his 3-year-old son, Karl. He searches bookshop after bookshop, looking at every children's title available, but everything he finds disappoints him. The books are either dreadfully boring, filled with moral lessons that would put any child to sleep, or they're overly sentimental tales that seem to have no purpose beyond making children cry. And worse still, none of them have engaging pictures. Children need pictures. Hoffmann knows this as both a father and a doctor who studies the mind. Frustrated and running out of time, he makes a decision. He buys a blank notebook and decides to create his own picture book. That evening, while his son sleeps, Hoffmann sits at his desk with pen and ink. He begins to draw and write, and what comes from his imagination would shock modern readers. He creates 10 stories, each one more gruesome than the last. He writes in simple, catchy rhymes in German, the kind that stick in a child's mind whether they want them to or not. He draws rough but powerful pictures, using bright colours that would attract children's eyes. Red blood, black ink, yellow flames, images designed to burn themselves into young memories forever. He titles his creation Funny Stories and Droll Pictures, though there's nothing funny about what he's created. Later, it would be renamed Struwwelpeter, which translates to shock-headed Peter or slovenly Peter, after the wild-haired creature that greets readers on the very first page. Hoffmann never intended to publish his creation. It was simply a personal gift for Karl, a father's attempt to teach his son proper behavior through memorable tales. But when friends visited the Hoffmann household and saw the book, their reactions were a mix of fascination and horror. They couldn't look away from those disturbing images and catchy rhymes. They asked to show it to their own children. Word spread through Frankfurt's educated circles. Publishers heard about this unusual children's book and expressed immediate interest. In 1845, the first edition was printed, and something extraordinary happened that no one had expected. It became an instant bestseller across Germany. Parents weren't disgusted by its graphic violence. They embraced it enthusiastically. They bought copies for their own children. They recommended it to friends and relatives. By the 1850s, demand had grown so strong that it was translated into English, opening up the massive British market. From there, it spread throughout the British Empire. Eventually, it would be translated into over 100 languages and sell millions upon millions of copies worldwide, making it one of the most successful children's books ever published. It became a staple of Victorian nurseries across Europe and America, sitting on bookshelves beside family Bibles and prayer books, as if it were equally essential to a child's moral education. Queen Victoria's own children likely had copies, and the most astonishing fact of all is that Struwwelpeter is still in print today, nearly 180 years later, still finding new generations of readers. So what exactly did Hoffmann create that so captivated and terrified Victorian parents and children alike? Let's open the book and see. The very first image a child sees is the title character himself, Struwwelpeter. He's a boy who refuses to cut his hair or trim his nails. His hair has grown wild and tangled like a lion's mane, standing out in all directions in a shock of messy chaos. His fingernails have grown into long curling claws that stick out strangely from his hands. He appears monstrous, frightening, barely human anymore. The message is clear. Personal hygiene isn't just about cleanliness. It's about remaining civilized, remaining human. Neglect these basic tasks, and you'll become something other, something to be feared and avoided. But unlike the other stories in the book, Struwwelpeter himself faces no punishment. He simply exists as a warning, a vision of what you'll become if you refuse to obey basic rules of grooming. This image became iconic, the face of the book that every Victorian child would recognize instantly. But the real horror begins with the stories that follow. The story of cruel Frederick tells of a boy who hurts animals without mercy. He whips his dog until it cries in pain. He kills flies simply for the fun of watching them die. He tears the wings off birds, enjoying their suffering. When his nanny objects to his cruelty, he throws her down the stairs. His evil behavior knows no bounds, and he faces no consequences until one fateful day when he whips his dog too hard. The dog, finally pushed beyond what it can take, turns on him and bites him badly. Frederick is stuck in bed, bandaged and suffering from his wounds. Meanwhile, in a darkly funny twist, the dog eats Frederick's dinner and sits in Frederick's chair, living the life that once belonged to the boy. The illustration shows Frederick helpless in bed, while his victim has taken his place. The message is brutal in its simplicity. Cruelty will be repaid with cruelty. Those you harm will eventually harm you in return. Then comes the dreadful story of Pauline and the matches, perhaps the most disturbing tale in the entire book. Little Pauline is left alone at home while her parents go out. They've warned her repeatedly never to play with matches, but the moment they leave, temptation overwhelms her. Two cats named Mince and Mounts watch her and cry out warnings in verse. "Meow! Don't touch! You'll burn yourself!" they wail, their voices rising in panic. But Pauline doesn't listen to the cats. She finds the matchbox and strikes a match, mesmerized by the dancing flame. The flame catches her dress and begins to spread. The illustration shows the fire creeping up her clothing while the cats watch in absolute horror, still crying out warnings that come too late. Their paws are raised, their mouths open in screams that cannot save her. The next page shows something that traumatized countless Victorian children. There's only a pile of ashes where Pauline once stood. 2 small shoes remain, the only proof she ever existed. The cats sit beside the ashes crying. Pauline has burned to death completely. There's no rescue, no miracle, no adult bursting through the door to save her. Just death, complete destruction, a child reduced to nothing but ash, and a pair of empty shoes. The story of the Inky Boys takes a different approach, one that reveals the complicated attitudes of the Victorian era. 3 boys encounter a dark-skinned boy and begin to mock him cruelly for his appearance. They laugh and point at him, their faces twisted with meanness. Suddenly, St. Nicholas appears, not the jolly Santa Claus of modern imagination, but a stern figure of judgment and punishment. He's furious at their racism and cruelty. As punishment, he grabs all 3 boys and dunks them into a giant inkwell, pushing them completely under black ink. When they emerge, they're even darker than the boy they mocked. The illustration shows 3 boys now black-faced, while the original boy walks away holding St. Nicholas's hand, proven right. Hoffman intended this as an anti-racism message, which was forward-thinking for 1845. But it uses racist imagery that's deeply problematic by modern standards, showing how even the most enlightened Victorian attitudes were still badly flawed in ways we recognize today. But the story that became most famous, the one that haunted more Victorian childhoods than any other, is the story of the thumbsucker. Little Conrad has a habit of sucking his thumbs, something many young children do for comfort. His mother warns him sternly before she goes out that he must not suck his thumbs while she's away. The moment the door closes behind her, Conrad cannot resist. He puts his thumbs in his mouth, savouring the familiar comfort. Suddenly, the door bursts open with a crash. Enter the great tall tailor, one of the most terrifying figures in all of children's literature. He's drawn as a nightmarish creature with impossibly long legs that stretch across the page. His hair is wild and messy. In his hands, he carries enormous scissors, shears so large they seem designed for cutting through something much thicker than thread. He runs at Conrad with supernatural speed, his long legs covering the distance in impossible strides. There's no time to react, no time to pull his thumbs away. Snip, snip. The scissors cut through both of Conrad's thumbs at once, cutting them off completely. In early editions of the book, blood sprays across the page in bright red, though this was softened in later versions. The final illustration shows Conrad with bandaged stumps where his thumbs used to be, crying in pain and horror. His thumbs are gone forever. He'll never have them back. This isn't a temporary punishment or a scare. It's permanent mutilation. The great tall tailor became a figure of absolute nightmare for generations of children, a monster that could burst through any door at any moment if they dared to disobey. The story of Augustus, who would not have any soup, follows a healthy, chubby boy who refuses to eat what his parents give him. Day 1 arrives and Augustus declares, "I won't eat soup," and pushes his bowl away. By day 2, he's clearly thinner. Day 3 finds him skinny and skeletal. Day 4 shows him as a walking skeleton, his bones visible through thin skin. On day 5, Augustus is dead. The final illustration shows his grave, a small mound of earth with his soup bowl serving as a headstone. He starved to death in just 5 days from refusing to eat his soup. The message is stark. Obey your parents about food, or you will die. This story reflects the Victorian obsession with nutrition and proper eating, but it also reflects the harsh reality that children did frequently die from malnutrition during this era. But where reality saw death as a tragedy, Hoffman's story turned starvation into a moral failing, a punishment for disobedience rather than a social problem. The story of Fidgety Philip introduces us to a boy who simply cannot sit still at dinner. He rocks in his chair, swings his legs, fidgets constantly, despite his parents' repeated warnings. He tilts too far back in his chair and begins to fall. In panic, he grabs the tablecloth to catch himself, but this only makes things worse. He pulls the entire meal down on top of himself in a massive crash. Food, dishes, silverware, everything falls down onto the floor. Philip sits in the wreck, covered in the ruined dinner. His parents stand over him, their faces showing horror and fury. His father points at him in rage. The message is clear. Hyperactive children are bad children. There's no understanding that Philip might have what we now call ADHD or another condition that makes sitting still difficult. To the Victorians, this was simply moral failure requiring severe punishment. The story of Johnny Look in the Air shows us a boy who walks around with his head tilted back, staring at the sky, lost in daydreams. He doesn't watch where he's going despite repeated warnings from adults. While looking up at birds, he walks straight off a dock and falls into a river with an enormous splash. The illustration shows him sinking into the water, his arms waving wildly, fish swimming around him as if he's just another creature in their world. Men rescue him with a net, literally fishing him out of the river like a caught trout. He's pulled out soaking wet, embarrassed in front of everyone. He's lost his school bag in the river and will have to explain this disaster to his teachers. The message is that daydreamers face real physical consequences. Pay attention to reality, or you'll suffer for your lack of attention. The final story, the story of Flying Robert, takes place during a terrible storm. All sensible children stay safely indoors while the wind howls and rain hits against windows. But Robert insists on going outside with his umbrella, ignoring his parents' orders and common sense. The wind catches his umbrella and lifts him into the air. He rises higher and higher, unable to come down, his legs hanging helplessly beneath him. The illustration shows him high above the town, the houses tiny below him as he's carried away by the storm. The final image comes with a chilling line, and to this day, nobody knows where he flew. Robert is gone forever, carried away by the storm, never to return. Presumed dead, lost to the world because he disobeyed and went out in the storm. This story captures the Victorian fear of disobedience, leading to permanent, irreversible loss. So why did Victorian parents embrace these horrific tales? To understand that, we need to understand what childhood really meant in the Victorian era. Our modern image of Victorian childhood often comes from cleaned-up versions, cosy scenes of children in pretty clothes playing with toys in safe nurseries. The reality was far darker. Child mortality rates were staggering. 1 in 3 children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Poverty was everywhere and brutal. Children worked in factories from dawn until dark, tiny hands running dangerous machines. They were sent down into coal mines because their small bodies could fit through narrow tunnels. They worked as chimney sweeps, climbing up inside chimneys still hot from fires, breathing in toxic ash that destroyed their lungs. There were no labour laws to protect them until very late in the Victorian era. And crucially, there was no concept of children as innocent beings who needed protection and nurturing. Children were viewed as small adults who needed to be broken and shaped into obedient citizens through harsh discipline. Victorian Christianity emphasized the doctrine of original sin. Children weren't born innocent. They were born wicked, naturally sinful creatures with the devil in them. The role of parents and educators was to drive out that wickedness through harsh discipline. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a saying, but a basic principle of child rearing. Physical punishment was normal, expected, encouraged. Breaking a child's will was considered essential to creating a moral, obedient adult. Against this backdrop, Dr. Hoffman actually considered himself progressive. As a psychiatrist, he opposed physical punishment and believed that psychological methods could be more effective. Struwwelpeter was meant as an alternative to beating children. Instead of striking them with canes and rods, you could scare them with stories. Use fear and psychological manipulation rather than physical violence. He genuinely thought this was more humane, a kinder way to achieve the same goal of absolute obedience. This was considered enlightened parenting in 1845. The book wasn't unique in using fear to control children. It was part of a long tradition of cautionary tales stretching back through medieval morality plays and religious texts. Children's literature before the 1800s was almost entirely preachy, designed to teach moral lessons with entertainment being secondary or non-existent. The Brothers Grimm fairy tales were similarly violent, filled with wicked stepmothers, children abandoned in forests, and gory punishments. But Struwwelpeter was revolutionary in being so graphically illustrated. Earlier cautionary tales relied on words to paint pictures in children's minds. Hoffman gave them actual images, rough but vivid, that burned themselves into memory through the power of visual horror. And here's what makes it even more disturbing. Real Victorian children faced punishments that were just as bad or worse than anything in Struwwelpeter. Physical punishment was universal. Children were caned, strapped, beaten with birch rods until they bled. They were locked in dark closets for hours, left to scream and cry alone in the darkness. They were forced to kneel on hard surfaces until their knees were bruised and swollen. They were made to wear dunce caps and signs announcing their failures, publicly shamed before their peers. Food was routinely denied as punishment. Being sent to bed without supper was considered a mild punishment. Compared to this daily reality of physical violence, Struwwelpeter's psychological torment actually seemed gentle to many Victorian parents. It was just stories after all, just pictures. No child was actually being beaten or starved when they heard about Augustus or Pauline. Victorian medicine added another layer of horror. Hoffman was a medical doctor, and Victorian medicine viewed children's behaviours as symptoms of illness requiring treatment. Thumb-sucking was believed to cause dental deformities and weak moral character. The cure? Restraints. Some doctors literally tied children's hands behind their backs or forced them to wear metal gloves at night. Masturbation was believed to cause insanity, blindness, even death. The medical treatments included everything from restraints to genital mutilation to burning with hot irons. Children were subjected to these genuine tortures in the name of medicine. Against this backdrop, the story of the great tall tailor cutting off thumbs with scissors actually seemed reasonable to many Victorian parents. At least it was happening in a story rather than in a doctor's office. The psychological impact of growing up with these stories planted itself deep in Victorian culture. Generations of children grew up with these images burned into their minds. In the 20th century, adults who had been Victorian children wrote memoirs mentioning Struwwelpeter, some with a strange nostalgia, others with lingering horror. British authors described nightmares about the great tall tailor that lasted into adulthood. German accounts told of children who were absolutely terrified to suck their thumbs, even in private, convinced the tailor would somehow know. But fascinatingly, there were also accounts of children who found the book funny and fascinating rather than frightening. This duality, this mixture of fear and attraction, reveals something important about how children process horror. The book's success created countless imitations and variations. By the 1850s, Struwwelpeter wasn't just a book, but an entire genre. Other authors created similar cautionary tales, some even more violent than the original, each trying to out-horrify the others. American versions added stories specific to American fears, like boys who played with firearms, or children who disobeyed warnings about Native Americans. The book even became a tool of political satire. During World War II, someone created Struwwelpeter, using Hoffman's format to mock Adolf Hitler. This shows the strange cultural staying power of the original. But why did respectable Victorian families embrace this book so enthusiastically? Part of the answer lies in its German origin. German culture was seen as sophisticated and scientific by the Victorians. The German education system was admired throughout Europe. If a German doctor recommended this method of teaching children, it must be good. There was also the respectability factor. It was a book, an object of learning and culture. Using a book to teach children seemed civilized compared to beating them with sticks. Parents could feel progressive and enlightened while still terrorizing their children into obedience. They were using modern, scientific methods rather than crude physical violence. What does Struwwelpeter reveal about Victorian society? Every single story emphasizes the same core message. Obey. Don't question. Don't explore. Don't resist authority in any way. Victorian society required rigid social order to function. The Industrial Revolution was creating massive social upheaval. Traditional structures were under threat, and the ruling classes felt that control slipping away. Children were being prepared for a society divided by strict social classes, where everyone had their place and was expected to stay in it. Working-class children needed to learn to obey factory owners without question. Middle-class children needed to obey social conventions. Upper-class children needed to obey their parents' plans for advantageous marriages. Compliance wasn't just desirable, it was essential for survival. The stories also reveal Victorian fears about chaos. Society was changing, rapidly, and people felt frightened by that change. These fears showed up in children's literature where breaking any rule leads to total destruction. Not just punishment, but death or permanent mutilation. This reflects deep adult anxieties about social collapse. If children stop obeying, if the lower classes stop accepting their place, if women stopped submitting to male authority, everything would fall apart. The stories are warnings not just to children, but about children, showing what happens when control is lost. Almost every story involves bodily harm: mutilation, burning, drowning, starvation. This wasn't accidental. Victorians were obsessed with bodily control. Children's bodies needed to be disciplined and controlled at all times. This reflected wider Victorian attitudes about sexuality, appetite, and physical expression. The body was seen as something that betrayed you, something that needed to be punished into submission. Natural urges had to be suppressed. The body was a battleground where the war between civilization and savagery was fought. The legacy of Struwwelpeter continues today. Modern child psychologists study it as an extreme example of fear-based parenting techniques, a demonstration of how not to raise children. Yet it's still in print, after 180 years. Some buy it as historical curiosity. Others purchase it with dark humor, finding entertainment in its extremes. Some academics study it to understand Victorian culture. And disturbingly, some parents still buy it, believing that children genuinely need fear to behave properly. In 1998, a musical called Shock-Headed Peter turned the stories into adult horror entertainment, treating them as the nightmare fuel they always were. Various art exhibitions have used Struwwelpeter imagery to comment on authority, control, and childhood trauma. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether we've really changed. Modern equivalents of fear-based parenting certainly exist. Scared. Straight programs take teenagers to prisons to frighten them away from crime. Parents use true crime stories to terrify children into compliance. Internet safety campaigns sometimes use horror tactics to scare children away from online dangers. Stranger danger has been taken to such extremes that many children are terrified of all adults. In 2014, two 12-year-old girls stabbed their friend, claiming they were trying to impress Slender Man, a horror character from internet folklore. This showed that horror stories still have tremendous power over young minds, just as Struwwelpeter did nearly 200 years ago. Are we really more enlightened than the Victorians? Or have we simply changed the medium while keeping the same basic philosophy of using fear and shame to control children's behavior? So was Dr. Hoffman right to create this book? The debate continues today. Does fear work as a motivator? In the short term, absolutely. Frightened children comply immediately. But in the long term, research shows that fear-based parenting creates compliant but anxious children who struggle with confidence and decision-making as adults. Understanding-based parenting creates confident, thoughtful children who can navigate complex situations. But fear is easier and faster and requires far less effort from parents. Hoffman wanted to help children avoid worse punishments, and by the standards of his era, he probably succeeded in some homes. Some parents used the book instead of beatings. Others used both the book and beatings. He may have reduced physical abuse in some households while introducing psychological abuse. History is complicated, and so are the people who make it. By 1845 standards, Hoffman was genuinely progressive. By modern standards, he was traumatizing children with psychological horror. Both things can be true at the same time. We can acknowledge his good intentions while also recognizing the harm his creation caused. This is the challenge of studying history. How do we judge people who lived in completely different worlds with completely different ideas about right and wrong? Do we measure them by their own era's standards or by ours? There's no simple answer. Why does Struwwelpeter endure after all these years? Because it captures something true about adult fear. Fear of losing control, fear of children's natural wildness and resistance to authority, fear of chaos overwhelming order. These fears haven't disappeared. They've just taken different forms in different eras. Every generation finds new ways to scare children into compliance while believing their methods are superior to what came before. Struwwelpeter is a mirror that shows us not just Victorian society but ourselves. It reveals Victorian anxieties about control, order, obedience, death, and punishment. But it also reveals our own ongoing struggles with these same issues. our own fears about raising children in an uncertain world, our own impulses toward control when we feel frightened. We like to think we're far removed from the Victorians, but scratch the surface and you'll find we're not as different as we'd like to believe. So I leave you with some questions to ponder. What children's content today will future generations find horrifying? What are we teaching children through fear without realizing it? Have we really progressed beyond Victorian methods, or have we just changed our techniques? Is Struwwelpeter simply a relic of a brutal past, or is it a warning about human nature itself? The great tall tailor's scissors are still sharp, still waiting, because every generation has its own version of the book that terrifies children. Every era finds new ways to scare them into obedience. Struwwelpeter never really died. He just changed his name and found new nurseries to haunt. What children's book traumatized you when you were young? Do you think fear has any place in parenting? Have you ever encountered Struwwelpeter or heard these stories? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into Victorian horror, subscribe for more dark history. Until then, remember this. The next time you tuck a child into bed with a gentle story, there was a time when bedtime stories were weapons designed to break children's spirits through psychological terror. And somewhere in an old library, on a dusty shelf, Struwwelpeter waits with his wild hair and his long, curling nails, still teaching lessons, still frightening children, still asking the question that haunts every generation. How far should we go to make children obey? See you in a future video.